My role is really, for me, a personal and a professional pleasure, is to introduce to you Bill Ouchi. Bill Ouchi is the Sanford and Betty Siegeloff Distinguished Professor at the UCLA Anderson School of Management. He has an academic pedigree that would blow your mind, culminating after his MBA at Stanford and a PhD at Chicago. He's written numerous books on business and management. He's paid by all sorts of companies throughout the world to be a guru on management, and he's known in every part of the world as one of those go-to people when you have to think about significant management restructuring. For reasons that I don't fully understand, he became interested in K-12 public education. He decided he wanted to look at schools and bring to bear the management principles that he had studied, refined, and implemented throughout the nation, indeed throughout the world. And then he wrote a book in 2003 called Making Schools Work. And he did it the hard way. He burned a lot of shoe leather looking at school districts, doing the analysis, running the numbers, and figuring out what are the things that make it work. What happened to me was I got a bootleg copy, I'm not going to tell them where, in 2002 when the mayor appointed me. Somebody gave me this copy, and it was all dog-eared. It wasn't a real book and everything. And I read it. And I called Bill Ouchi, and I asked him to come to New York, talk to us. And then when we started our work, he did some consulting for us. Since then, he's burned a lot more shoe leather, looking at school districts, coming to conclusions about the things that work and don't work. Why is it that the same great curriculum, whichever one you love, gets entirely different results in different schools? Why is it that there are schools in this city that have class size of 28 and 29 getting better outcomes day in and day out than comparable schools with class size of 23 and 24? Why is it? Why is it? Why is it? And I submit to you, it is a product of understanding precisely what people like Bill Ouchi and a few special other people in America, who, as I say, could consult for $2,000, $3,000 an hour if they'd like, have decided to put their talent and energy to working on. I've learned a lot from them. I continue to expect I'll learn a lot more from them. It's my pleasure to introduce you to him today, Professor Bill Ouchi.
It's very meaningful for me to be here with so many people who have given their lives, either as volunteers or as professionals, to caring about the children and caring about the schools of New York City. You have kept alive the idea that management matters, that independence and autonomy for teachers and schools matters, and that DNA is still running around through the city because of you. I have visited 442 schools in the 8 U.S. districts that are now implementing an approach nearly identical to the one that Chancellor Klein and Mayor Bloomberg have pursued in New York City. And it works. It works in all 8 of them. It stops working if you change chancellors and you bring in a foreign body who doesn't get it. But if the leadership has the commitment, it works. It's been working since 1973 in Edmonton, Canada, a district of 80,000 students, a blue-collar town, lowest income city in the province of Alberta. It works so well there that now urban districts all over Canada are emulating what Edmonton has created. But I get ahead of myself. I want to talk about the problem that decentralization is meant to address and why it works. I want to tell you about the secret of TSL. If I say to you TSL, TSL is the single most important thing for you to know about a school. How many of you know what TSL means? So it is a secret indeed, and I'll tell you what it means in a moment. Then I'll tell you from my research what I've seen has been the fundamental elements. I'm going to go through as an example of the implementation of this approach, New York City, which has been more complete, more disciplined, more thorough, and as my data show very clearly, more successful in its impact on student performance than any of the other 8 districts in bringing about this change. The problem is large size. Every study shows that as organizations grow beyond about 1,500 employees, if they perform factory or repeated work, and grows beyond 150 employees if they are engaged in professional work as teachers are, begins to develop bureaucratic pathologies that are familiar to all of us. In the U.S., before World War II, we had 127,000 school districts serving about 25 million children. Today, we have twice as many children, 50 million, and only 16,000 school districts, and thus the typical school district of today is 15 times the size of its predecessor before World War II. Yet, the school districts of today, all 16,000, except for the 8 that I have studied, are run in a centralized top-down fashion. During the reception today, I spoke with a New York City principal who's part of the CEI-PEA network of some 70 very independently run, very innovative and successful schools. He told me that he came from Westchester County. And I said, wow, you must miss that. They had twice as much money per student as you have in New York City. He said, that's true, but it's not the money that's the only thing that matters. Up there, the superintendent and the school board tell you what to do. Here, I have a chancellor who lets principals decide how to run their schools. And as a result, I've been able to make the changes that have taken me from inheriting a CUNY school to having a successful school. We have a big achievement gap, and we all know that. But notice that despite that gap, the great majority of students in this country are still white, and we can add in Asian. And what that means is that curricula are designed and textbooks are written overwhelmingly for the majority. And it means we tend to adopt solutions, if they are one size fits all, that do not fit children who are limited English speakers, who are recent immigrants, who are from low-income families, who are African American and Latino especially, does not fit them well at all. As a result of the fact that all 16,000 of our school districts are centralized and do not meet the needs of many children, especially from low-income neighborhoods and of color, we have seen the rise of charter schools. And the rise of charter schools has had a great impact both on teachers' unions and administrators' unions, and on parents, and on school districts. Because the one thing that is distinctive about all charter schools is that each of them has complete autonomy of decision-making. People sometimes say to me, you're a business school professor and you're trying to take a business approach, but we think the principal should be an instructional leader, not a business leader. And I reply to them, well, tell me this, does your principal control who gets sent to the school, who is an employee of the school? Well, no, that's a central office that does that. Well, can the principal decide to have 10 fewer administrative staff and instead have 10 more teachers? Well, no, that's set by formula in the central office. Well, does the principal control the curriculum of the school through which you deliver the standards set by the state to the students? Well, no, the curriculum is set by the district. Well, does the principal control the choice of professional development programs that his or her teachers attend? Well, no, the central office designs those and then we're forced to send our teachers. Well, then the principal must control at least the schedule. Well, no, we have schools that start at 7:20, schools that start at 8:10, schools that start at 9:15, and if we didn't do that, he would mess up the bus schedules. Well, then my question, and what does it mean for the principal to be the instructional leader if she does not control any of the variables that are important to instruction. The antidote in studies of large companies in every industry and in every country of the world is decentralization of the key operating decisions to the smallest possible operating units. In a school district, that means to the principals. There's a book that was published a few years ago that reviewed the research by education specialists on decentralization. It said decentralization doesn't work, no easy solution ever does. Well, I have news for those of you who believe that. Decentralizing a school district is not easy. It is the most difficult challenge that a chancellor or superintendent could possibly undertake. However, decentralization in a school district, especially a large one, is the only solution, because management does matter, because you cannot have an organization of large size organized in the same top-down manner of an organization of small size. It will not work. TSL stands for total student load. If you're a fan of Theodore Sizer, you know the concept. Sizer argued that no teacher should ever have responsibility for more than 80 students. I learned that lesson when I did a study in New York City, my first study in New York City in the year 2000 and 2001. I visited 66 New York City schools, interviewed the principals, went through their budgets with them line by line to find out what they controlled and what they did not. One of the things I did was to visit Bronx High School of Science, one of the most famous schools in America, where the English department told me that they were all maxed out. They each had 170 students. Now, they said to me, do you think that it's possible to assign a research paper and read and write thoughtful comments on logical development, content, paragraph structure, sentence structure, grammar, punctuation, spelling, and citation style on 170 papers? The answer is no. How about getting to know 170 adolescents, each of them well enough to interact with them in a meaningful way? Is that possible? No. So what's happened across America is what's happened at Bronx Science. The brightest children in New York City in an 11th grade English class write each semester 3 papers, 2 short and 1 long. That doesn't sound too bad, except that a short paper is a maximum of 3 pages, and a long paper is not more than 5. And I gave this talk at the University of Michigan 2 years ago about my first book, and 2 professors came up to see me afterwards and said, "You've now explained why my students from Bronx Science always fail. They don't know how to write. No one's taught them." In some cities, it's well known that no teacher reads student work. All they do is check off whether it's been handed in. And if a student hands in everything, they get an A. And they take home a report card full of A's, and their families think everything is wonderful until that child takes the PSAT, when they find out otherwise, but it's too late. In New York City, by union agreement, the maximum that a middle or high school teacher can be asked to do is teach 5 classes of 34 students each for a maximum total student load of 170. In fact, if we eliminate very small load schools like special schools, like magnet schools, the typical total student load is 140. Now, I've studied the 2 first cohorts of New York City's autonomously run schools, the ones that were launched in September of 2004 and in September of 2005, and I followed them ever since then. They have an average total student load of 87.8, not of 140. In Boston, where the contractual maximum is 140, The actual average is 85, very low. They've done a very good job of that. They did not have the kind of principal training that New York City has developed. They did not have the system of principal coaching, especially for newly appointed principals, that New York City has. And they did not have the kind of accountability system that includes actual visits to each school by an experienced team of outsiders that gives feedback to the principal, as New York City has. And because of those differences, the gains in driving down total student load are much more modest in Boston than in New York City. Now, this makes a very unusual and interesting experimental design, because in both Boston and in New York City, at the time of my study, there were some schools that had been granted autonomy and others that had not. So I was able to make this comparison, which isn't usually possible. Now, this is a busy chart, but it's a crucially important one, and I want to point out a couple of things to you. First of all, start in the leftmost column, and I simply list the 8 school districts that I studied. Again, visiting 442 schools. I had a team of 11 research assistants. We spent 4 years gathering the data. There are no existing data. If you want to study the management of a school district, nobody has those data. If you want to know the total student load, you can't ask because nobody knows. So you have to go. We went out there in every school. We listed every employee in every school that we visited and described what they did for their job. We laid out the curriculum as it looks from the standpoint of a teacher, as it looks from the standpoint of a student, and we've done an immense analysis. Second column. When I visited New York City for the first time in 2001, principals controlled, on average, 6.1% of the money spent in their schools. Today they spend 85, they control 85%. In St. Paul, Minnesota, they actually control 87%. In Boston, the pilot school principals control 75%. In the other cities which are autonomous, as you can see, there's a big range. So you can implement decentralization, and you can implement it in a lukewarm way, or you can go full bore. Now, New York City and St. Paul have gone full bore. The other cities have taken it by partial measures, by and large. Now let's look at the total student loads in high school. You can see that Houston has very high total student loads at 160, even though principals there control 74% of the money. And that is because Houston didn't have any of the DNA that New York City has. It didn't have a Cy Flegel. It didn't have a New Visions. It didn't have a Debbie Meyer. It didn't have an Eric Nadelstern. It didn't have people who were familiar with Ted Sizer's work. It didn't have people who knew Central Park East. And it didn't figure out that principals, given their freedom, could drive down TSL by replacing administrative jobs with more teachers, by using a creative approach to curriculum design and scheduling to further reduce total student load. So you see there's a huge range, and you see that New York City has done extremely well. Really, Boston does have a lower TSL. However, if you look at the change from the district average, you will see that the next column shows when you increase the principal's budgetary autonomy by 10 percentage points, in New York City, the result is the average total student load per teacher drops by 25 students. In Boston, it drops by only 4. And the reason is that only some principals in Boston are doing it. Those principals that are doing it in Boston are getting 25, 50 student reductions in total student load, but not all of them are doing it. Whereas in New York City, almost all of the principals in those first 2 cohorts have been tutored in how to make these kinds of gains. And finally, what's the effect on percent proficient? What's the real money number? And the answer is, for a 10 percentage point increase in principals' autonomy, percent proficient in New York City rises by 11 percentage points. No other city comes even close. I visited an elementary school in St. Paul. Traditionally, elementary schools have all students study English language arts at 8 in the morning when the students are fresh. That's the theory. So they have 20, 22, 25 students, whatever it is, and they do their reading. In St. Paul, instead what they have done is they have scheduled every class to teach reading at a different time. They have hired paraprofessionals not to run the Xerox machine, not to do duty on the playground or in the lunchroom, but to be trained as reading coaches. And they've used their extra money when they've reduced administrative positions to hire reading specialists. And long story short, during ELA time, they bring a flying squad into every classroom in grades K through 3. They break down the 23 or 24 students into groups of 5 to 7 students. One reading teacher with 5 to 7 students. The teacher, if you watch them every time, further subdivides that into the reds and the blues, depending on their reading level, and then sets them to work independently, and the teacher goes one-on-one with each student. Education has to be one-on-one. If you don't have a design in your school that allows you to get down to one-on-one, education won't happen for everybody. Now, on the other hand, Lowell High School in San Francisco is like Bronx Science. It's a test-in school. It's a large school. It has the most unusual schedule I have seen anywhere in America, and I visited now 750 schools in my 2 studies. And the purpose of their schedule is that every single student at Lowell has an opportunity at least once every week to see every one of their teachers in office hours. They don't need one-on-one in the classroom, but they need to be able to see the teacher who can give them the atta-girl, the pat on the back, the piece of advice, the challenge, right when they need it. That's what keeps them going and makes them a success. All 8 of the districts have instituted choice. Choice clarifies accountability. When you assign students to schools, principals have students, revenues, and budgets, whether they run a failing school or a good school. And they can explain away anything you come up with as a criticism. But when their school is 1/3 empty and the district is full, they haven't got a leg to stand on. It's a crucial part. It enhances, CEI has written about this in detail. I feel embarrassed I'm carrying coals to Newcastle, but choice does a lot of good things. Schools are empowered with the 4 freedoms that we'll mention. You must have a rich system of accountability, not simply reporting standardized scores on state tests and weighted student formula. Real choices. Here's what happens. In Edmonton, 50% of the children voluntarily now attend out-of-zone schools. In Denver, 30%. In San Francisco, 40%. In Oakland, after 1 year, 30% attend out-of-zone schools when they're given choice. It's clear that families want to have a choice. Why not give them a choice? New York, of course, now does that. Principals need 4 freedoms to control their budget, their staffing pattern, their curriculum, and their schedule. In my first study, Edmonton, the leader, the granddaddy, had 92% budget control by principals, Seattle 79%, Houston 59%. On the other hand, I compared them to Chicago, which at the time had 19% local budget control. Los Angeles was 7%, and New York City, as I said, was 6%. In the second study, which you already saw on that big busy slide, they were all over the lot. Some, Chicago has a very unusual approach. And this isn't fair to them really because it was the first year of their program. They hadn't yet defined autonomy. And I don't want to cast aspersions on Chicago because the fact of the matter is they've made really substantial gains. They now have 200 schools that are being run autonomously. It's about more than 1/3 of all the Chicago city schools. But New York City was very dramatic. And when we went into the schools, here's what we found. Principals, given their freedom, choose to trade in administrative positions in the school and instead hire more classroom teachers. So let me tell you a bit about New York City, which has been, as I've said, I think the model from which I think every other school district in this country is already learning. I hear all over the country that everybody who's interested in the decentralization approach, and there's lots of districts that are interested, they're all coming to New York City. A lot of your schools have become the educational equivalent of Yosemite National Park. They have edu-tourists, coming through by busloads wanting to visit these wonderful schools that you now have. I understand that not every school in New York City is there. Not every school in New York City is wonderful. But let me tell you that when I visited a randomly selected 66 schools in the year 2001, almost none of them was wonderful. What I heard from principals in 2001 was a consistent complaint. The district is tyrannical, top-down, centralized. They talk decentralizing, they're lying, they don't mean it. This place is just completely unmanageable. Now I go and I visit principals in New York City, and I ask a principal, who do you report to? They think for a minute, and they say, Joel Klein. Other than that, I'm the boss of my school. What a wonderful thing. If you decentralize management, you have to have capable principals. If you have large schools, it means you have to have lots of principals who have deep and broad leadership experience, enough to run a school with 300 employees and 3,000 or 4,000 students, and no district has more than 3 or 4 such people. But if you have small schools of 400 students or so, then a highly skilled, experienced teacher with no management experience can run that school successfully, can be a leader in that school. So if you have a big district, you have to decentralize, and the only way you can do it is with small schools, because small schools don't put pressure on the leadership that you have. Last September of '07, this approach was extended to all 1,467 schools, and each principal must choose a support organization from among 6 LSOs, each headed by a former senior executive of the New York City Department of Ed, or 4 PSOs, of which our host, Cy Flegel, is one, with his 70 schools approximately that they support, or from the Empowerment Schools organization headed by Eric Nadelstern and his team. And under this system, the schools control the 4 major freedoms. They control their budget, staffing, curriculum, and schedule. The district provides a very rich, in fact, by far the most complete accountability system I have seen anywhere, a choice system for families, a selection and training of principals. I have visited the New York City Leadership Academy. I have visited, I've been teaching in business schools now for 38 years. 38 years, that's a pretty long time. I have visited training programs all over the world, leadership training programs. I visited the famous leadership training centers of IBM and General Electric. In my opinion, the New York City Leadership Academy is the best leadership training program anywhere in the world of any kind, period.